What happens when a single moment shatters everything you believed about your family's past? For 26-year-old Grace Sullivan, a bartender struggling to keep her head above water while her grandmother fights cancer, that moment came in the form of a stranger's emerald cufflinks. For Harrison Montgomery, a real estate mogul whose empire spans 3 states, it was the beginning of the end of everything he thought he knew about his legacy. He was just trying to survive another 14-hour shift at the Copper Rose, an upscale steakhouse in downtown Richmond. He was just another wealthy patron in an expensive suit. But when Grace noticed the distinctive emerald, eagle carved into his platinum cufflinks, identical to the pendant her grandmother Rose had worn every day for 50 years, a casual comment would unravel a web of lies that had taken decades to weave. This isn't a story about coincidence. This is about how one woman's determination to honor her grandmother's memory exposed the dark foundation of one of Virginia's most powerful families, and how sometimes the truth buried deepest is the one that threatens to destroy everything. But one humid Tuesday evening in July, a single glance at a stranger's jewelry would change everything. The Copper Rose buzzed with its usual Tuesday evening energy, a perfect storm of clinking crystal, sizzling steaks, and the low murmur of Richmond's elite conducting business over $30 entrees. Grace Sullivan moved through the elegant dining room with practiced efficiency, her black uniform pristine despite the chaos of another dinner rush. The restaurant's warm lighting cast everything in amber tones, from the mahogany paneling to the crystal chandeliers that sparkled like captured starlight. At 26, Grace had mastered the art of invisible service, present when needed, non-existent when not. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat chignon, and her green eyes held the kind of tired determination that came from working multiple jobs to pay for her grandmother's experimental cancer treatments. The insurance companies had labeled Rose Sullivan's condition terminal and her treatments experimental, which was their polite way of saying they wouldn't pay. Grace was refilling water glasses at table 12 when the hostess seated him. Even from across the dining room, Harrison Montgomery commanded attention. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man who had never been told no, his charcoal Armani suit fitting him like a second skin. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his steel blue eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing territory. Montgomery was a legend in Richmond real estate circles, the man who had transformed entire neighborhoods with a signature and turned abandoned warehouses into luxury condominiums. His company, Montgomery Development Group, owned half the skyline, and his personal net worth was rumored to be somewhere north of $800 million. Grace approached his table with her standard greeting smile. "Good evening, Mr. Montgomery. Welcome to the Copper Rose. Can I start you off with something to drink?" He barely glanced up from his phone. "Macallan 25 neat. And bring me your wine list, the reserve selection, not the regular one." "Of course, sir." Grace turned to leave, then froze. As Montgomery reached for his napkin, his sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing platinum cufflinks that made her breath catch in her throat. Each cufflink was adorned with an intricately carved emerald. Not just any emerald, but one shaped into a soaring eagle with wings spread wide, tiny diamonds forming stars around its head. The design was unmistakable. Grace had seen it every day of her life, hanging from a delicate gold chain around her grandmother's neck. Rose called it her miracle pendant, the only thing her father, Patrick Sullivan, had left her when he died in 1973. It was supposedly one of a kind, designed by a master jeweler in Ireland for her great-grandfather's service in World War II. But here it was, duplicated in platinum and emeralds, adorning the wrists of one of Richmond's most powerful men. Grace's hands trembled slightly as she set down his water glass. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Montgomery, but I couldn't help noticing your cufflinks. They're absolutely beautiful." Harrison looked up, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to guarded attention. "Thank you. The eagle design, it's so unique. My grandmother has a pendant with the exact same motif. The eagle with the diamond stars." Grace's voice was steady, but her heart hammered against her ribs. "She's always said it was one of a kind, a family heirloom from Ireland." The color drained from Harrison's face. He slowly lowered his phone, his steel blue eyes locking onto hers with laser intensity. "I beg your pardon." "The emerald eagle with the star pattern," Grace continued, pointing gently at his cufflinks. "It's identical to my grandmother's pendant, even down to the way the wings curve and the tiny diamonds positioned around the head. She's had it for over 50 years. Harrison's jaw tightened. He glanced around the dining room, then back at Grace, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "That's impossible. These cufflinks were custom-made for my grandfather in 1955 by Cartier. The design is exclusive to the Montgomery family. There is no other piece like it." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sir, I've seen my grandmother's pendant every day of my life. I could draw that eagle from memory. It's definitely the same design." "Then your grandmother," Harrison said, each word precisely enunciated, "is either mistaken about its origins, or she's in possession of stolen property." The accusation hit Grace like a physical blow. Rose Sullivan was the most honest person she knew, a woman who would drive across town to return a $20 bill she'd found on the sidewalk. The suggestion that her beloved pendant was stolen was not just wrong, it was insulting. "My grandmother is not a thief," Grace said quietly, but her voice carried a steel that made several nearby diners look over. "And she's not mistaken. That pendant belonged to her father, my great-grandfather, Patrick Sullivan. He earned it through his service, and it's been in our family for decades." Harrison studied her face, searching for signs of deception or delusion. Instead, he saw unwavering certainty and a fierce, protective love that reminded him uncomfortably of his own relationship with family legacy. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim leather wallet, extracting $500 bills and placing them on the table. "Miss Sullivan, Grace Sullivan, Miss Sullivan." Harrison stood, his imposing height casting a shadow over the table. "I suggest you verify your family history before making such claims. Heritage can be a fragile thing, and sometimes the stories we're told aren't the whole truth." He headed toward the exit, then paused at the door, turning back to deliver one final comment that would haunt Grace for days. "If your grandmother truly has a piece matching my family's exclusive design, then perhaps we need to have a longer conversation about how she acquired it." The restaurant's warm ambiance suddenly felt stifling. Grace stood among the crystal and candlelight, holding a wine list with shaking hands, watching one of Virginia's most powerful men disappear into the Richmond night. She had served him for less than 10 minutes, but somehow their brief encounter felt like the beginning of something that would change everything. The drive to Richmond General Hospital was a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. Grace's ancient Honda Civic rattled through the humid July night, the air conditioning long since dead, leaving her windows down and her hair whipping in the warm breeze. Harrison Montgomery's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the stories we're told aren't the whole truth. She found Rose in room 314, propped up against a stack of pillows, her silver hair spread across the white hospital gown like spun moonlight. Despite the cancer that was slowly stealing her strength, Rose's eyes still held the bright intelligence that had made her a beloved high school English teacher for 37 years. The emerald eagle pendant rested against her collarbone, catching the fluorescent light. "Gracie, sweetheart," Rose said, her voice thin but warm. "You're here late." "Rough shift?" Grace pulled a chair close to the bed, her gaze fixed on the familiar pendant. "Grandma Rose, I need to ask you about Dad Patrick's eagle." Rose's expression immediately became guarded. She touched the pendant reflexively, a gesture Grace had seen thousands of times. "What about it, dear?" "I met someone tonight who had cufflinks with the exact same design. He said his family commissioned it exclusively from Cartier in 1955, and that there's no other piece like it in existence." The heart monitor's steady beeping seemed to accelerate slightly. Rose was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the Richmond skyline. "Who was this person?" "Harrison Montgomery." The real estate developer. Rose's face went ashen. She gripped the bed rails with both hands, her knuckles white against the chrome. "Montgomery," she whispered, and the name sounded like a curse. "Grandma, you're scaring me." "What's wrong?" Rose closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were filled with a pain that had nothing to do with cancer. "I knew this day would come. I've been dreading it for 50 years. Grace leaned forward, taking her grandmother's trembling hand. "What do you mean?" "Patrick Sullivan wasn't my real father, Gracie." The words came out in a broken whisper. "He was my stepfather and the kindest man who ever lived. But this pendant, it didn't belong to him. It belonged to my biological father. A man I never knew, who abandoned my mother when I was 3 years old." Grace felt the ground shifting beneath her. "Who was your real father?" Rose's voice was barely audible. "His name was Thomas Montgomery. And according to what my mother told me on her deathbed, he was the heir to one of Virginia's wealthiest families." The revelation hit Grace like a physical blow. Montgomery. Harrison Montgomery's family. "Are you saying we're related to them?" "I don't know," Rose admitted, tears streaming down her cheeks. "My mother, God rest her soul, told me Thomas was forced to give me up because his family wouldn't accept a child born to an Irish immigrant seamstress. She said he left her this pendant as proof of who my father was, in case I ever needed it." Grace stared at the emerald eagle, seeing it with completely new eyes. Not a family heirloom from Ireland, but evidence of a connection to one of Richmond's most powerful dynasties. "Why didn't you ever try to find out more?" "Because I was terrified," Rose whispered. "Terrified of what I might find. Your great-grandmother Anna made me promise to never seek them out. She said they were dangerous people who would destroy anyone who threatened their reputation. She lived her whole life looking over her shoulder, afraid they'd try to take me away from her." The hospital room fell silent, except for the hum of machines and the distant sounds of the city. Grace held her grandmother's hand, processing the magnitude of what she'd just learned. If Rose's story was true, then she wasn't just Grace Sullivan, struggling bartender from Richmond's working-class South Side. She was potentially Grace Montgomery, descendant of one of Virginia's founding families. "Grandma, we need to find out the truth." Rose shook her head weakly. "It's too dangerous, sweetheart. These people, they've had decades to bury whatever happened. If they wanted to acknowledge me, they would have done it by now. But what if they didn't know about you? What if Thomas Montgomery tried to find you and his family stopped him?" The possibility hung in the air between them. Grace could see the war playing out in her grandmother's eyes, hope battling against a lifetime of fear and protection. "Promise me something, Gracie," Rose finally said, her grip tightening on Grace's hand. "If you decide to pursue this, be careful. The Montgomery family didn't build their empire by being kind to people who inconvenience them," Grace promised, but her mind was already racing. She thought about Harrison Montgomery's shock when she'd mentioned the pendant, the way his face had changed from annoyance to something that looked almost like recognition. Had he known about Rose's existence? Was he part of a cover-up that had been going on for decades? One thing was certain: the simple life Grace had known was over. She was about to step into a world of wealth and power that would either embrace her as family or destroy her for daring to knock on their door. 3 floors above the city, Harrison Montgomery stood in his penthouse office, staring out at the glittering Richmond skyline he had helped shape. The building's glass walls reflected his troubled expression as he turned his grandfather's cufflinks over in his hands, examining the emerald eagles he'd worn to 1,000 business meetings without giving them a second thought. Grace Sullivan's words haunted him. I could draw that eagle from memory. The absolute certainty in her voice, the protective fire in her green eyes when he'd suggested her grandmother might be a thief. It wasn't the reaction of someone running a con. It was the reaction of someone defending a truth they'd never questioned. Harrison walked to his private safe, a temperature-controlled vault hidden behind the original Monet. Inside, among legal documents and family heirlooms, he found what he was looking for: a velvet-lined box containing the complete set of his grandfather's jewelry. The cufflinks were part of a larger collection, a ring, a pocket watch, a tie pin, and according to the original Cartier documentation, a pendant designed for feminine wear. He'd never seen the pendant. As far as he knew, it had been lost decades ago. But the Cartier records were meticulous, and the photographs were crystal clear. The emerald eagle design, identical to his cufflinks, hanging from a delicate gold chain. Harrison's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. Margaret Sinclair answered on the first ring, her voice crisp despite the late hour. As his head of security and family affairs, Margaret was accustomed to unusual requests at all hours. "Margaret, I need you to run a complete background check on someone. Grace Sullivan works at the Copper Rose restaurant. But more importantly, I need everything you can find on her grandmother, Rose Sullivan. Focus on family history, particularly any connection to the name Montgomery." "How deep do you want me to go?" Margaret's voice was professional, but Harrison could hear the curiosity underneath. "DNA deep," Harrison replied. "And Margaret, this is beyond confidential. No one else in the family is to know about this investigation. No one." After hanging up, Harrison poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat in his leather chair, staring at the cufflinks that had started this earthquake. He thought about his grandfather, Charles Montgomery, the man who had built the family's real estate empire from nothing. Charles had been ruthless in business, legendary for his ability to acquire property and eliminate competitors. But he'd also been a devoted family man, or so the carefully curated family history claimed. What if that history wasn't complete? What if Charles Montgomery had secrets that died with him? Harrison had built his own fortune on the foundation his grandfather laid, but now he wondered what else might be buried beneath that foundation. His private line rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed his cousin, William Montgomery III, the family's designated heir to their old money status and social connections. William managed the Montgomery Foundation and served on the boards of a dozen Richmond charities, maintaining the family's reputation while Harrison built their wealth. "Harry, we need to talk." William's voice was tight with anxiety. "I just heard you made a scene at the Copper Rose tonight. Something about family jewelry?" Harrison's blood ran cold. "Who told you that? Does it matter? Richmond's social scene is smaller than you think, and people talk. What's this about some waitress claiming to have Montgomery family heirlooms?" The speed of the gossip network was staggering. Grace's conversation with Harrison had taken place less than 4 hours ago, and already it was making its way through Richmond's elite circles. Harrison realized with growing dread that this story was about to take on a life of its own. "It's nothing, William. A misunderstanding. Don't lie to me, Harry. I've spent my entire life protecting this family's reputation. If there's some skeleton about to crawl out of our closet, I need to know about it now." Harrison hesitated. William had always been the guardian of family traditions, the keeper of their social standing. But he'd also been the one to orchestrate the burial of embarrassing family stories, like the time their uncle had been arrested for drunk driving, or when their cousin had been caught embezzling from his law firm. William made problems disappear. "I'll handle it," Harrison said finally. "See that you do." William's voice carried a warning. "Because if this becomes a public embarrassment, if some gold-digging waitress thinks she can shake down our family with a fake story and a piece of costume jewelry, she'll discover that the Montgomery family has resources she can't imagine." The threat was clear, and it made Harrison's stomach turn. He'd built his fortune through aggressive business tactics, but he'd never crossed the line into intimidation or worse. William, however, seemed to have no such compunctions. After ending the call, Harrison stood at his window again, watching the city sleep below. Somewhere out there, Grace Sullivan was probably lying awake too, wondering what she'd stumbled into. He found himself hoping she was smart enough to be afraid, because whether she was a con artist or a long-lost relative, she had just made herself a target of one of Virginia's most powerful and ruthless families. The next morning brought no relief from the July heat. Richmond sweltered under a haze of humidity that made the air shimmer like water, and the Copper Roses dining room felt like a greenhouse despite the industrial air conditioning. Grace had barely slept, her mind churning through everything Rose had told her about Thomas Montgomery and the mysterious pendant that connected them to a family that seemed determined to deny their existence. She was setting up tables for the lunch service when her manager, David Chen, approached with a concerned expression. David had hired Grace 2 years ago and had become something of a protective older brother, always making sure she got the best shifts and tip opportunities. "Grace, we need to talk," David said, his voice unusually serious. "My office now." Grace followed him to the cramped space behind the kitchen, her heart sinking. David's office was barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, its walls covered with staff schedules, health department certificates, and photos from restaurant events. He closed the door and turned to face her, his expression troubled. "I got a call this morning from corporate," David began. "Harrison Montgomery contacted them personally. He's requesting that you be removed from any tables he might occupy in the future." Grace felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. "He's trying to get me fired?" "Not fired exactly, but he's a major client. His company hosts events here regularly, and he's personally dropped over $50,000 at this restaurant in the past year alone. When someone like that makes a request, corporate listens. David, I didn't do anything wrong. I was polite, professional." "I know you were," David interrupted. "That's why I'm giving you a heads up instead of just reassigning you." "Grace, what the hell happened last night?" "Montgomery doesn't usually care enough about individual servers to remember their names, let alone request they be kept away from him." Grace sank into the second chair, her hands shaking. She told David about the cufflinks, about Rose's revelation concerning her real grandfather, about the growing suspicion that the Montgomery family had been hiding secrets for decades. David listened without interruption, his expression growing more concerned with each detail. "Jesus, Grace," he said when she finished. "You've opened a can of worms that could destroy your life." "What do you mean?" David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My ex-wife used to work for one of Richmond's big law firms. She told me stories about what happens when people cross the old money families. Harassment, lawsuits, jobs disappearing, credit ruined. These people have resources you can't imagine, and they use them to protect their interests." The weight of the situation was starting to crush Grace. She'd thought she was just satisfying curiosity about a family heirloom, but instead, she'd apparently declared war on one of Virginia's most powerful dynasties. "What should I do?" "Honestly, let it go. Take care of your grandmother, focus on your own life, and pretend this never happened. Because if you push this, Grace, you're going to lose. They have armies of lawyers and private investigators and political connections. You have student loans and a sick grandmother." Grace stood up, a spark of defiance igniting in her chest. "So I should just accept that they can erase my family's history? Just let them pretend we don't exist?" "I'm saying you should pick your battles. And this one will destroy you." Grace left David's office more determined than ever. The Montgomery family's immediate response, trying to isolate her, intimidate her, make her disappear, only confirmed that they were hiding something significant. People didn't react with such swift, overwhelming force unless they were terrified of what might be exposed. She drove to the Richmond Public Library, a massive neoclassical building that housed one of the most comprehensive genealogical research centers on the East Coast. If the Montgomery family wanted to play hardball, Grace would arm herself with the only weapon she had, the truth. Librarian Janet Kowalski was a research specialist who'd helped Grace with college papers years earlier. Janet's expertise in historical records and family genealogy was legendary among Richmond's amateur historians, and she took a particular pleasure in helping people uncover their roots. "Grace, what brings you back to the archives?" Janet's smile was warm and genuine, her silver hair pinned back with vintage barrettes that matched her retro-style glasses. "I need to research the Montgomery family of Richmond, specifically focusing on the 1940s and 1950s. I'm looking for any mention of a Thomas Montgomery who might have had relationships outside the family's social circle." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Montgomerys? That's some serious old money history you're diving into. Any particular reason? Grace hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. Family research. We think there might be a connection, but the family's stories don't match the official records. Ah, that's more common than you'd think, Janet said, leading Grace to a computer terminal. Wealthy families often have edited versions of their histories. The real stories tend to be messier than what makes it into the society pages. Over the next 4 hours, Grace immersed herself in decades of Montgomery family history. She found society page mentions, business records, property transactions, and charitable donations. The Montgomerys had been fixtures in Richmond society since the 1920s, their name appearing in connection with everything from hospital wings to university endowments. But as she dug deeper, Grace began to notice gaps. Thomas Montgomery appeared in family photos, and society mentions through 1952, then virtually disappeared from the public record. Birth announcements for other Montgomery children continued through the 1950s and 1960s, but Thomas seemed to have been erased from the family narrative after his early 20s. Janet, Grace called across the research room. Can you help me find death records for Thomas Montgomery, born around 1930? Janet joined her at the computer, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Let me check multiple databases. That's interesting. No death certificate on file for any Thomas Montgomery matching those parameters in Virginia. Let me try surrounding states. After an hour of searching, they had found nothing. No death certificate, no obituary, no burial record. Thomas Montgomery hadn't died. He had simply vanished from documented existence. This is unusual, Janet admitted. Usually wealthy families are meticulous about documenting deaths, especially for estate purposes. Either he died somewhere very far from Virginia or what? Or he was deliberately erased from the family records while he was still alive. I've seen it before with families who disown children for marrying outside their social class or engaging in behavior the family considers scandalous. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. The evidence was mounting that Thomas Montgomery had been systematically removed from his family's history, which meant Rose's story about being abandoned by a wealthy father who was forced to give her up was probably true. But if Thomas was still alive when he was erased from the records, what had happened to him? And why was the current Montgomery family so determined to keep Grace from asking questions? She was about to find out that the Montgomery family's resources extended far beyond lawyers and private investigators. They were about to demonstrate exactly how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. Grace was walking to her car in the library parking lot when she noticed the black sedan. It had been parked across from the library when she arrived, and now it was following her at a discreet distance as she drove home. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she took several unnecessary turns, watching the sedan mirror her movements. By the time she reached her apartment complex in Richmond's Church Hill neighborhood, Grace was certain she was being followed. The sedan parked across the street as she pulled into her designated spot, its tinted windows making it impossible to see who was inside. Grace's apartment was a modest one-bedroom on the second floor of a converted Victorian house, furnished with a mix of thrift store finds and hand-me-downs from Rose. She double-locked the door behind her and went immediately to the window, peering through the blinds at the sedan that remained motionless on the street below. Her phone rang, startling her so badly she nearly dropped it. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize. "Hello? Miss Sullivan?" The voice was crisp, professional, with the faint trace of a southern accent. "This is Margaret Sinclair, representing the Montgomery family interests. I believe we need to discuss your recent inquiries." Grace's mouth went dry. "How did you get this number?" "Miss Sullivan, I think you'll find that your privacy is less protected than you might imagine. I'm calling to arrange a meeting between you and Mr. Harrison Montgomery. Tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock at his offices downtown. And if I refuse?" There was a pause, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice carried a subtle but unmistakable threat. "I don't think you want to refuse, Miss Sullivan. You see, we've been looking into your background, your financial situation, your grandmother's medical expenses. It would be such a shame if Rose Sullivan's treatment options became limited due to insurance complications. The threat was crystal clear. Comply or watch your grandmother die. Grace's hands shook with rage and terror. You can't do that. Miss Sullivan, you seem to misunderstand the nature of power in this city. The Montgomery family has connections in every hospital, every insurance company, every institution that might affect your life. We're not threatening you. We're simply explaining reality. Grace looked out the window again. The sedan was still there, its occupants watching her building. She was trapped between agreeing to meet with people who could destroy her life and refusing to meet with people who could destroy her life. 2 o'clock tomorrow, she said finally, her voice steady despite her terror. Excellent. The Montgomery building, 40th floor. And Miss Sullivan, come alone and don't bring any recording devices. This is going to be a very private conversation. The line went dead, leaving Grace staring at her phone in the gathering twilight. Outside, the black sedan remained motionless, a reminder that the Montgomery family's reach extended into every corner of her life. She called the hospital to check on Rose, keeping her voice cheerful and normal despite the terror clawing at her chest. Her grandmother was stable, resting comfortably, unaware that her medical care was now being held hostage by a family that would rather see her die than acknowledge her existence. Grace spent the night researching everything she could find about Margaret Sinclair and Harrison Montgomery's business practices. What she discovered made her blood run cold. Margaret Sinclair was a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned into private problem-solving for wealthy clients. Her specialty was making inconvenient people and situations disappear through a combination of legal pressure, financial leverage, and what she euphemistically called environmental management. Harrison Montgomery's business record was equally troubling. His real estate empire had been built through aggressive acquisitions, often involving properties owned by families in financial distress. Former business partners described him as brilliant but ruthless, someone who would destroy competitors without hesitation if they threatened his interests. By morning, Grace had made her decision. She would go to the meeting, but she wouldn't go defenseless. She called in sick to work, then drove to an electronics store where she purchased the smallest recording device she could find, a digital pen that could capture hours of audio. If the Montgomery family wanted to threaten her, she would at least have evidence of their tactics. The Montgomery building was a gleaming tower of glass and steel that dominated Richmond's financial district. Grace felt like an ant walking into the lion's den as she approached the security desk in the marble-lined lobby. The guards were expecting her, efficiently directing her to a private elevator that whisked her directly to the 40th floor. Harrison Montgomery's office was bigger than Grace's entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a panoramic view of Richmond, and the furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. Harrison stood with his back to her, looking out at the city he'd helped reshape, still wearing the Emerald Eagle cufflinks that had started this nightmare. "Miss Sullivan," he said without turning around, "thank you for coming. Did I have a choice?" Harrison turned, and Grace was struck by how tired he looked. The confidence and authority were still there, but underneath she detected something that might have been regret. "Please sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Margaret Sinclair was already seated at a conference table, her silver hair pulled back severely and her dark suit making her look like a funeral director. She gestured to a chair across from her, and Grace noticed that the recording pen in her purse was positioned to capture everything. "Miss Sullivan," Margaret began, "we've completed our investigation into your background and your grandmother's claims. What we've discovered is complicated." Harrison joined them at the table, placing a thick file in front of Grace. "We found Thomas Montgomery." Grace's heart stopped. "What do you mean you found him?" "He's alive," Harrison said quietly. 87 years old, living in a care facility in Norfolk under the name Thomas Sullivan. He's been there for 15 years, suffering from advanced Alzheimer's disease. The revelation hit Grace like a tsunami. Her great-grandfather was alive. The man Rose had wondered about her entire life, the father she'd never known, was 90 minutes away in a nursing home. How is that possible? How did you find him when we couldn't? Margaret opened the file, revealing decades of financial records. Because my family has been paying for his care since 1973, Harrison admitted. When my grandfather Charles died, I inherited not just his business empire, but also his obligations. One of those obligations was a trust fund that provides for Thomas Montgomery's medical expenses. Grace stared at the documents, her mind reeling. Your family knew where he was this whole time. Not just knew, Margaret said, her voice clinical. They put him there. In 1954, Thomas Montgomery was institutionalized by his own family after he refused to give up his relationship with your great-grandmother, Anna Sullivan. The truth was more horrifying than anything Grace had imagined. They had him committed. Harrison's face was grim. Mental health laws were very different in the 1950s. Wealthy families could have inconvenient relatives institutionalized for moral insanity or sexual deviance. Thomas's crime was falling in love with an Irish immigrant and refusing to abandon his daughter. Grace felt sick. So they just locked him away? For 5 years, Margaret continued, during which time Anna Sullivan was told that Thomas had died in an accident. She raised Rose believing her father was dead, never knowing he was trapped in an asylum less than 100 miles away. When Thomas was finally released in 1959, Harrison added, his mind was broken. The treatments they used, electroshock therapy, experimental drugs, had destroyed much of his memory and cognitive function. He could never have functioned independently, so my grandfather arranged for private care under a new identity. Grace was crying now, tears of rage and heartbreak streaming down her face. You destroyed him. Your family destroyed an innocent man because he fell in love with someone beneath your social status. Yes, Harrison said simply. We did, and we've been covering it up for 70 years. Margaret leaned forward, her expression hardening. Which brings us to the present situation, Miss Sullivan. You now know a family secret that could destroy the Montgomery reputation and cost us hundreds of millions of dollars in business relationships and charitable partnerships. Grace wiped her eyes, steel entering her voice. So what are you going to do? Have me committed to? Nothing so dramatic, Margaret replied. We're going to offer you a choice. Accept a substantial financial settlement, enough to cover your grandmother's medical expenses and provide you with financial security for life in exchange for signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, or what? Harrison's voice was quiet but firm. Or we destroy you. Your credit, your employment prospects, your grandmother's medical care. We make your life so difficult that you'll wish you'd never heard the name Montgomery. Grace looked between them, seeing the absolute certainty in their faces. They weren't bluffing. They had the resources and the ruthlessness to follow through on their threats. But they were also offering her everything she'd ever dreamed of: financial security, Rose's medical bills paid in full, a future without the constant stress of poverty. All she had to do was agree to bury the truth about her family's history and Thomas Montgomery's decades of suffering. How much? She asked quietly. Margaret smiled, sliding a contract across the table. $5 million, placed in a trust fund that will provide you with a substantial annual income. Your grandmother's medical expenses fully covered at the best facilities available. And a promise that the Montgomery family will never interfere in your life again. Grace stared at the contract, the numbers swimming before her eyes. $5 million. She could quit her job, focus on spending Rose's remaining time with her, never worry about money again. All she had to do was sign away her family's truth. But as she looked at the documents, Grace thought about Rose, lying in that hospital bed, still wearing the emerald eagle pendant that represented her father's love. Rose had spent her entire life wondering about Thomas Montgomery. creating stories about his heroism to fill the void left by his absence. How could Grace tell her that her father hadn't died a hero's death, but had been destroyed by his own family for the crime of loving her mother? And yet, how could she not tell her? How could she let Rose die without knowing that her father had fought for her, had been punished for refusing to abandon her? "I need time to think about this," Grace said finally. Margaret's expression sharpened. "I'm afraid that's not possible. This offer expires at the end of this meeting. Sign now or face the consequences." Grace looked at Harrison, searching his face for any sign of compassion. What she saw instead was a man trapped by his own family's legacy of cruelty. "And if I sign this, what happens to Thomas? Does he spend his remaining years alone in that nursing home, with no family to visit him?" "Thomas Montgomery died in 1954, Margaret said coldly. "Thomas Sullivan is a different person with no family connections. That's how it has to stay." The heartlessness of the statement galvanized Grace. They weren't just asking her to hide the truth, they were asking her to abandon her great-grandfather completely, to let him die alone and forgotten, just as they had condemned him to live. "No," Grace said, standing up. "I won't sign your contract, and I won't be silenced." Harrison's face hardened. "Miss Sullivan, you're making a terrible mistake. You have no idea what you're up against." "Maybe not," Grace replied, walking toward the door. "But I know who I am and I know what's right. And keeping an 87-year-old man cut off from his family isn't right." As Grace reached for the door handle, Margaret's voice stopped her cold. "Miss Sullivan, by tomorrow morning your grandmother's insurance will be reviewing her case for potential fraud. Her current treatments will be suspended pending investigation. I wonder how long she can survive without them." Grace turned back, her eyes blazing with fury. "You would let an innocent woman die to protect your secrets?" "We would do whatever is necessary to protect our family's interests," Margaret replied. "The choice is yours." Grace left the Montgomery building with her hands shaking and her mind racing. She had perhaps 12 hours before they would begin their campaign to destroy her life. She needed help, and she needed it from someone with enough power to stand up to the Montgomery family. That afternoon, Grace found herself in the offices of the Richmond Times-Dispatch, sitting across from investigative reporter Michael Torres. Torres had built his career exposing corruption among Virginia's elite, and his series on political influence peddling had won a Pulitzer Prize 3 years earlier. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Torres said, reviewing the notes he'd taken during Grace's story. "The Montgomery family institutionalized one of their own sons for 70 years because he fell in love with an Irish immigrant, and they're now threatening to kill your grandmother if you expose the truth." "That's exactly what I'm saying," Grace replied. "And I have proof." She played the recording from her meeting with Harrison and Margaret, watching Torres's expression grow darker as he heard their threats. When the recording ended, Torres sat back in his chair, whistling softly. "Grace, this is either the story of the decade, or you're about to be destroyed by one of the most powerful families in Virginia. Are you absolutely certain you want to go down this road? My great-grandfather has been locked away for 70 years. My grandmother is dying, and they're threatening to cut off her medical care. What choice do I have?" Torres nodded slowly. "Then we need to move fast. I'll need documentary evidence, the trust fund records, Thomas Montgomery's medical files, any communications between the Montgomery family and the care facility. Can you get access to any of that?" Grace thought about it. "Thomas is in Norfolk. If I can prove our family relationship, I might be able to get access to his records as next of kin." "Do it," Torres said, "but be careful. If the Montgomery family realizes what you're doing, they'll move quickly to shut this down. You probably have less than 24 hours before they make their move against your grandmother." Grace left the newspaper office with a plan and a prayer. She drove straight to Norfolk, her ancient Honda pushing its limits on I-64. The Seaside Care Facility was a pleasant-looking building surrounded by gardens, the kind of place that cost thousands of dollars a month and catered to families who could afford the best. At the front desk, Grace took a deep breath and played her last card. "I'm here to see my great-grandfather, Thomas Sullivan." I just discovered he was here, and I'd like to arrange visitation." The receptionist, a kind-faced woman named Betty, smiled warmly. "Oh, how wonderful. Thomas doesn't get many visitors." "Are you family?" "Yes, his great-granddaughter. I have identification and some family documents that should establish the relationship." Grace presented her driver's license and the Emerald Eagle pendant, explaining its connection to Thomas. Betty examined the pendant with growing excitement. "This is amazing. Thomas has been asking about this pendant for years. He has memory issues, but he's always talked about a green eagle that was important to his daughter. The staff thought it was just confusion, but you actually have it." Within an hour, Grace was sitting in a sunny common room, face-to-face with Thomas Montgomery Sullivan. He was a frail man, with wispy white hair and gentle blue eyes that reminded her painfully of Rose. When Grace showed him the Emerald Eagle pendant, his eyes widened with sudden clarity. "Anna," he whispered, reaching for the pendant with trembling hands. "Anna's eagle. You found it." "I'm not Anna," Grace said gently. "I'm Grace, Anna's great-granddaughter." "Anna was my great-grandmother. Rose is my grandmother, your daughter." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, his mind struggling to process the information. Then tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Rose, my little Rose? She's alive." "Yes, she's alive. She's been looking for you her whole life, thinking you were dead." For the next 2 hours, Thomas shared fragments of memories with startling clarity. He remembered Anna's laugh, the way Rose would clap her hands when he sang to her, the men who came to take him away. He remembered fighting them, screaming that he would never abandon his daughter, and then darkness. "They said I was sick," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "Said I needed treatment, but I wasn't sick. I just loved your great-grandmother." Grace recorded everything on her phone, creating a testimony that would shatter the Montgomery family's carefully constructed lies. But more importantly, she was giving Rose the gift she'd dreamed of her entire life, proof that her father had loved her, had fought for her, and had never willingly abandoned her. As Grace prepared to leave, Betty approached with a concerned expression. "Miss Sullivan, I need to tell you something. About an hour after you arrived, we received a call from someone claiming to be Thomas's family lawyer. They asked if anyone had been visiting him, and they seemed very upset when I mentioned you were here." Grace's blood ran cold. The Montgomery family already knew she'd found Thomas. She was running out of time. She drove back to Richmond through the gathering darkness, her phone buzzing constantly with calls from numbers she didn't recognize. She ignored them all, focusing on getting to the hospital to see Rose before the Montgomery family could make good on their threats. Grace found Rose awake and alert, reading poetry by the light of her bedside lamp. The older woman looked up as Grace entered, immediately sensing something momentous in her granddaughter's expression. "Gracie, what's happened? You look like you've seen a ghost." "In a way, I have," Grace said, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Grandma Rose, I found your father. Thomas Montgomery is alive." The poetry book fell from Rose's hands. She stared at Grace in stunned silence for a full minute before finding her voice. "That's impossible. He died when I was 3. Grace told her everything, the meeting with Harrison Montgomery, the discovery of Thomas's institutionalization, her visit to the care facility. She played the recording of Thomas remembering Anna and Rose, watching her grandmother's face cycle through disbelief, heartbreak, and overwhelming joy. "He's been alive all this time," Rose whispered, tears streaming down her face. "All these years I thought he'd abandoned us." "He never abandoned you," Grace said firmly. "He was stolen from you." "But Grandma, there's more. The Montgomery family is threatening us. They want to keep this secret buried, and they're willing to hurt you to do it." Rose's expression hardened with a strength that defied her illness. "Let them try. I've spent 70 years wondering about my father, creating stories to fill the void. Now I know the truth, and I'll be damned if I let them bury it again." Grace's phone rang. The caller ID showed Michael Torres from the newspaper. "Grace, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for hours." The Montgomery family just filed injunctions against 3 major newspapers, trying to prevent publication of any story involving their family history. They're moving fast to shut this down. It's too late, Grace said, looking at her grandmother's determined face. We're going public. All of it. Are you sure? Once this story breaks, there's no going back. Your life will never be the same. Grace thought about Thomas Montgomery, alone in his nursing home for 70 years. She thought about Anna Sullivan, dying believing the father of her child had abandoned them. She thought about Rose, wearing the emerald eagle pendant every day as a reminder of a love story she thought had ended in betrayal. I'm sure, Grace said. It's time for the truth. The next morning, the Richmond Times-Dispatch published Michael Torres's exposé under the headline, "Buried Alive, How Virginia's Elite Destroyed a Man for Love." The story detailed Thomas Montgomery's institutionalization, the Montgomery family's decades-long cover-up, and their current threats against Grace and Rose. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the story had been picked up by national news outlets. Social media exploded with outrage over the Montgomery family's actions. Protesters gathered outside the Montgomery building, demanding justice for Thomas and accountability from Harrison Montgomery. By noon, Harrison Montgomery had resigned from his company's board of directors. Margaret Sinclair had disappeared, reportedly fleeing to a country without extradition treaties. The Montgomery Foundation was under investigation by multiple government agencies. But the most important response came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, one of Richmond's most respected geriatricians, called Grace personally. "Miss Sullivan, I've been following your story in the news. I'd like to offer my services to facilitate a reunion between your grandmother and great-grandfather. Pro bono, of course. What the Montgomery family did was unconscionable, and I want to help make it right." 3 days later, in a sunny room at Richmond General Hospital, 4 generations of the Sullivan family were finally reunited. Thomas Montgomery Sullivan, transported from Norfolk in a medical van, sat holding Rose's hand while Grace documented every moment. Despite his Alzheimer's, Thomas seemed to recognize something essential about Rose, calling her "my little girl" and singing half-remembered lullabies in a voice cracked with age and emotion. "I never forgot you," Thomas whispered to Rose, "even when they made me forget everything else. I never forgot you." Rose pressed the emerald eagle pendant into his palm, completing a circle that had been broken for 70 years. "And never stopped believing you loved me, Daddy. I never stopped hoping I'd see you again." As Grace watched her grandmother and great-grandfather together, she felt a profound sense of completion. The truth had come at a tremendous cost. The Montgomery family's threats had materialized into real harassment, job loss, and ongoing legal battles. But none of that mattered compared to the joy on Rose's face as she held her father's hand. 6 months later, the Montgomery family's legal empire had crumbled. Criminal charges had been filed against several family members for conspiracy and elder abuse. The family's assets were being liquidated to pay for reparations to Thomas and other victims of their decades-long campaign of intimidation. Harrison Montgomery, facing bankruptcy and criminal prosecution, approached Grace one last time. They met in the same hospital where Rose was receiving palliative care, her cancer finally winning the battle they'd fought for so long. "I want you to know," Harrison said quietly, "that I never knew the full truth about what my family did to Thomas. I inherited their secrets along with their money, and I handled it wrong. I should have helped you from the beginning." Grace studied his face, seeing genuine remorse beneath the exhaustion and defeat. "Why didn't you?" "Fear," Harrison admitted. "Fear of losing everything I'd built, everything I thought I was. I was so focused on protecting the family legacy that I forgot families are made of people, not just money and reputation." "What will you do now?" Harrison managed a bitter smile. "Start over, I suppose. Try to build something honest for once." He paused, then added, "The emerald eagles, the original cufflinks and pendant, they belong to your family. They always did. Grace accepted the cufflinks, not as trophies of victory, but as symbols of a truth finally acknowledged. She placed them beside Rose's pendant on the hospital room's windowsill, where they caught the afternoon light like captured flames. Rose passed away peacefully 3 weeks later, surrounded by family and holding her father's hand. Thomas Montgomery Sullivan, despite his advanced Alzheimer's, seemed to understand the significance of the moment. At Rose's funeral, he placed the emerald eagle pendant in her casket, returning the symbol of their love to the daughter who had worn it faithfully for 70 years. Thomas himself died 6 months after Rose, finally at peace, after decades of confusion and isolation. Grace arranged for him to be buried beside Anna Sullivan, reuniting the couple whose love had been powerful enough to threaten an empire. At the joint memorial service, Grace stood before a packed church and told the complete story of the Sullivan-Montgomery family saga. She spoke about love that transcends social boundaries, about the courage to seek truth even when it's dangerous, and about the importance of family connections that can't be severed by wealth or power. Thomas Montgomery Sullivan and Anna O'Brien fell in love in 1949, Grace concluded. Their love created my grandmother Rose, and Rose's love created my mother, and my mother's love created me. The Montgomery family tried to erase that love from history, but love doesn't die just because powerful people wish it would. It endures, it grows stronger, and eventually, it demands to be acknowledged. In the audience, Michael Torres was taking notes for his follow-up story, the one that would win him his second Pulitzer Prize. But Grace wasn't thinking about news stories or awards. She was thinking about the emerald eagle pendants, now buried with Rose and Thomas, symbols of a love story that had finally found its proper ending. The Montgomery family's wealth was gone, their reputation destroyed, their secrets exposed. But the Sullivan family's legacy, built on love, truth, and the courage to fight for what's right, would endure for generations to come. Grace used the settlement money from the Montgomery family's criminal penalties to establish the Thomas Montgomery Sullivan Foundation, which provides legal aid and advocacy for families separated by institutional abuse and cover-ups. She returned to school, earned a law degree, and dedicated her career to preventing other families from suffering the way hers had. Years later, when people asked Grace if she regretted the decision that had upended her quiet life, she would always give the same answer. My great-grandfather spent 70 years locked away because he loved my great-grandmother. My grandmother spent 70 years wondering if her father had abandoned her. That pain ends with my generation. Sometimes the truth costs everything, but silence costs even more. The emerald eagles, those symbols of love and sacrifice, had finally found their way home. And in a quiet cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, under matching headstones that read, "Beloved Father, Devoted Daughter, and True Love Never Dies," Thomas Montgomery Sullivan and Rose Sullivan rested together, their story complete at last. What started as a casual comment about jewelry in an upscale restaurant had become a testament to the power of truth and the endurance of love. Grace Sullivan proved that one person's courage can topple empires built on lies, and that family bonds forged in love are stronger than any force that tries to break them. The Montgomery dynasty fell, but the Sullivan legacy, built on truth, justice, and unwavering love, would endure forever. Sometimes the phoenix doesn't just rise from ashes. Sometimes it burns down the entire corrupt structure so something better can take its place. If this story of love conquering power and truth overcoming corruption moved you, remember that real families are still fighting for justice against powerful interests every day. Share this story with someone who believes in the power of truth, and never forget that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to let injustice stand. The truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how deeply it's buried or how powerful those trying to hide it might be.